It's Radio Free 501c, the podcast of Rogue Tulips Consulting. I'm Cecilia Sapp. Don't forget to subscribe. You don't want to miss any of our exciting episodes like this one today. I'm joined by first-time guest Jeff De Cagna of Foresight Works and returning guest Dean West of Association Laboratory. We have some big thinkers here on this episode because we're talking about the future of thought leadership for the nonprofit management profession. Welcome to episode 221. Hey everybody, it's Monday, December 11th, and that means it's time for another episode of Radio Free 501c, brought to you by Rogue Tulips Consulting. I'm Cecilia Supp, your host. I'm the principal and founder of Rogue Tulips Consulting, and thank you so much for being here with us today, especially our global audience. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you may be. Today, I decided to see how many big brains we can fit in one podcast, so I'm going to try 3. I'm joined today by 2 of my friends and colleagues, Dean West and Jeff De Cagna, who are big thinkers in our profession. And why am I describing them as big thinkers? Because we're here to talk about the future of thought leadership, and we're all not fond of that phrase. So I am going to ask Jeff to please introduce himself, say hello to our audience, and tell us a little about yourself.
Well, Cecilia, thanks very much for having me on as a guest. I'm Jeff De Cagna, Executive Advisor for Foresight First LLC. I'm in Reston, Virginia, and I've been in the association nonprofit community for more than 30 years and consulting for more than 20 years. It'll be, I think, 22 years come February of 2024. And, I can talk about it in 5 words now. My 5 words are I try to help association boards become more. Because I think that, as we move deeper into this decade, we are facing critical situations and more upheaval and tougher decisions, and we need our boards to elevate their performance and set a higher standard of stewardship, governing, and foresight. So that's what I focus on. I do other things working with associations and nonprofits, but that's the primary focus of my work.
Great. Well, thank you, Jeff. And I also want to welcome Jeff as a first-time guest on the podcast. And we're looking forward to having him back next February, where he's going to
Thanks.
talk about the duty of foresight. So watch for that episode. And I want to welcome back my longtime friend and many-time guest, Dean West of Association Laboratory. Dean, please say hello and tell us a little about yourself.
Thanks, Cecilia. It's good to be back. Always enjoy these conversations. I'm president of Association Laboratory and started the company now 25 years ago. 2024 is our 25th anniversary. So look forward to all exciting stuff next year, which isn't too far away. And we do 3 things. One is we are a traditional research and strategy firm, working on things as broadly as emerging leaders in DEI to strategic planning. The company is the leading source of association sector research on the association industry through our Looking Forward brand. And then we produce content and experiences designed to improve nonprofit competencies, particularly among executives and boards, through such mechanisms, for example, our Healthcare Strategy Summit, which we do in February. And good to be back. Good to see my longtime colleague, Jeff De Cagna, who I met many years ago, and Cecilia many years ago. Always fun to chat with everybody.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you. Yeah, this ought to be a good one. So, our topic is the future of thought leadership, and a lot of people in the world look thought leaders, quote unquote, as people that we should model, people we should listen to, people we should follow. But as we were discussing, as we were prepping for this episode, there's a lot of different things that go into thought. One of the first ones is the actual action of thinking. But then, what is the purpose of what we're doing with this information? And Dean made a really good point. Is it knowledge transfer, or are we in a process of discovery? So I think that's a good question to start with, Dean. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I think when we get away from the use of thought leader as a promotional concept to brag about yourself or your company, what you're asking yourself really as a person, are you attempting discovery of new boundaries or new ways of thinking about the association or any other profession? And you're examining it from different perspectives and trying to see if what works really does work, or whether we should rethink the models, rethink the roles, rethink the responsibilities, etc. And I think oftentimes we confuse thought leadership, which is a discovery process, with education, which is a knowledge transfer process, which is I know a thing and I'm going to teach other people. And it's equally valid, equally useful. It's just a different thing. So I think one of the questions for people who aspire, quote, to be a thought leader, so to speak, is not to think of it as I want to pat myself on the back at how smart I am. It's picking an arena in which you can focus your discovery interest to examine the boundaries within which our profession works. And that can be simple things, it can be complex things, but it's a fun thing to do regardless.
Yeah, that's well, Jeff. That's a really good point. What do you think about that?
Well, I have a number of different thoughts about the whole idea of thought leadership in that frame. I think we all agree that it's a less helpful concept than it could be. So we don't not particularly fans of it. I do think it's important to note that there are people who see themselves as thought leaders or who are regarded as thought leaders who actually are that. They actually are bringing important information, insight, perspective to the table. So I wouldn't want to negate what other people are doing. It's just not something that I particularly think is good, not a way that I prefer to be identified. I also think that for an organization, an association or a nonprofit, to make a decision to say, okay, we want to pursue a strategy around thought leadership where we see some advantage for our organization, I think that's fine. That's a choice one could make or an organization could make. For an individual, it feels a little too self-referential, and I'm just as guilty as the next person, because I used to use this term, especially at the beginning of my consulting career, and it was something that um, had been assigned to me by others, even when I was still an association executive, and then I went to become a consultant, and it followed me, and I did use it for a while, but then more than a decade ago, and I'm thinking it's probably closer to 15 years at this point. I took it out of my bios, took it out of my intros. Sometimes it pops up without my knowledge. It just kind of comes out of someone's mouth when I'm being introduced. And so I have stopped sort of referring to myself in that way for a long time, and I really do deflect it as something that someone would say, especially when I'm in front of an audience, because I don't want people to come into that situation and hear that phrase and expect that they're there to, as sort of alluding to what Dean's talking about, that they're to sit passively and accept my information, when in point of fact, as someone who is an educator and who values deeply the learning process in every aspect of my work, um, I want them to be part of the learning process, to really be actively thinking and not just accepting, a knowledge transfer kind of situation. So I think there are problems, but I don't think that everyone who is in this category is somehow wrong to see themselves that way, because I do think there are legitimately capable and smart people who have things to say, and we shouldn't completely dismiss that.
Well, and I agree with that, but I think those people are probably more like you and not calling themselves a thought leader. Other people might put that label on them. But I gotta say, I've had a problem with that term thought leader for years, a long time. And I thought I was missing something. I'm like, what am I missing here? Everybody's thought leader this, thought leader that. And then I read a book called Winners Take All, which talked about this whole concept of thought leadership and who thought leaders, quote unquote, are. And in that book, it describes how a lot of people who are thought leaders, because they're being marketed, their work is diluted and diminished to the point where it's almost meaningless. And so I think the problem with the term thought leader is it gives legitimacy to people who maybe don't deserve that legitimacy, or somebody who is being called a thought leader, they're being diminished in a way because their work's being dumbed down in a lot of ways. Now, this is one book, one take. You might be out there, I love TED Talks, I love thought leaders. But I think what we have to be considering in anything is, who are we listening to and why are we listening to them? So, for example, you both have a long track record of contributing to thought because you both have had an evolution in your thought. You've both had an evolution in what you're doing. And I wrote down, as we were preparing for this episode, the term the maturity arc of the true thinker. And I think what we need to focus on more than thought leaders, quote unquote, is the thinkers. Who's out there thinking? Who's exploring? Who's asking the better questions in our profession? My voice over the last few years has been really around talking about our profession, promoting our profession, the ethics of our profession, that true identity of our profession. and try, because we make the world a better place in our profession. And so that's kind of what I have been focusing on, in addition to some of the other writings I've been doing. But I have also noticed, and this is just me, and I'm okay, sorry guys, I didn't tell you I was going to ask this question. I'm kind of dropping a bomb. It seems to me in our profession that all of the thought leaders are men, and there are no women thought leaders. Nobody is identified as a thought leader who's a woman. And yeah, sure, there's great people out there like Elizabeth Engel's always writing these wonderful white papers and stuff, but you never hear that term attached to a woman. And I've always found that kind of an odd thing. I'm just throwing that out there. You don't need to respond to it, but I just think it's kind of odd.
No, I would like to comment on that because I completely agree, and not just men, but basically white men.
Mhm.
And and I was very fortunate a few years ago to receive the Academy of Leaders Award from ASAE, and the reason why I'm mentioning is not to sort of position myself as look how great I am. It's there was a story attached to this that I wanted to share, which was, I mean, what I've done in my career is, you can see you can see this descriptor when you go to my LinkedIn profile. I list myself as an association contrarian. So basically, what that means, I've spent most of my career, certainly my consulting career, pushing back on what associations do, right? Essentially challenging the orthodox beliefs of our community. And so when I received the award in 2019, I went to an event and I spoke with someone who was also a past recipient. And he said to me, you've got to feel real, considering what you do, you've got to feel really good, to be recognized in this way, because it would not be something you would expect. And it really changed my perspective on being recognized in that way. And so when I accepted the award in Columbus in 2019, I felt a strong sense of, like, I'm really privileged to be able to do what I do, as a white man, and be able to push back on things, because it's accepted a whole lot differently coming from me than I think it might be accepted from someone who doesn't look like me. And so I agree with you. We need to raise up, all of the big and important thinkers across our community, and go past the idea that it's only white men who are sort of leading the charge of things. We have, people like you, Cecilia, and Elizabeth and Shelley Alcorn and others, and all three of you are white women. So we need to also be reaching beyond those boundaries, to really elevate our quote unquote thought leadership, but our big thinking in this community, so that we're recognizing all of those voices. And that's especially important as we move deeper into this decade, into the 2030s.
Great. Dean, any comment?
I don't know. We routinely work with women thought leaders, routinely work with women of color as thought leaders. On our healthcare stuff in particular, the majority of CEOs we work with are women. Majority of staff teams, or senior staff teams, are women. So I'm not clear where your perspective comes from on this, because it's such a routine thing for us to work with people of different races, and in particular women, on topics from emerging leaders to membership, that I don't think a thing about it. I went to the forum the other day. It's an overwhelmingly women-dominated organization. They had to actually change some of their programs because it was exclusionary to men. They did that last spring, and so I think there's a lot of confirmation bias behind race and gender, based on your friends. When we put together programs for our private events, when we work with clients, one of the principal drivers is diversity of perspective. And as a result of that, we end up working with a wide variety of race and of gender and of business setting and of et cetera, based on the organization. So I think from my standpoint, I don't see that, because we actively put in place mechanisms to avoid it. But sometimes, the really smart person is a white guy, and there's nothing wrong with that too. So we don't seek out, quote, thought leaders based on their race or gender or other demographic characteristics. We seek out the best people we can find, and frankly convince to participate with us, because they have to want to be participating with it. So I don't see it as being an issue, frankly. Our sector research on DEI doesn't necessarily confirm that. either, although we don't study it heavily on that topic, to be honest. But for me, that's been a non-issue.
Oh, that's great. No, I'm glad to hear that. I don't equate senior leaders with thought leader. That term thought leader of being a person set apart from other people.
Oh yeah,
And
but your thought leaders often come from your senior executive core, not just your consultants.
well,
And I mean, we started doing private events 5-6 years ago. Again, we had nothing but women representatives because they're easy to find in our sector, and so it's really easy to find, frankly. And so again, if you're looking for a thing, you find a thing. And I think there's a lot of just confirmation bias. There are overwhelming numbers of women who are incredibly intelligent, incredibly successful, and have been for decades in our sector. And so to pretend it's all just white dudes just isn't correct factually. Stage at ASAE 2 years ago, I think everybody but one person was a woman. Board members, award winners, etc. I just can't remember if that was last year or 2 years ago now. But so some of the gender and racial confirmation bias, I think, gets in the way of us actually deciding who is a quote a voice we want to hear, regardless of what they look like, regardless of their gender, stuff like that.
Yeah, no, there's definitely a lot of women in our profession. Actually, I haven't checked the data for a few years, but more than 50% of people that work in nonprofit management of any type is a woman. There's been some challenges, they say, with women in the executive suite. But again, I have seen there's lots of women in the executive
It's near parity at CEO.
So yeah. So that's changed, that shifted. And I'm not saying that we can't find women in the profession and that we can't find smart women in the profession. The point I'm obviously making badly is that you don't see a lot of women who are elevated to this level. And I'm not saying that it can't be white men. I love white men. Okay. I'm married to one.
I see a lot of women I just don't see your evidence of this, Cecilia. There's nothing but women on panels, nothing but women speakers. If that's not being elevated at the same level, what is?
Well, I think part of the reason why we're seeing more of that, because I can easily recall a time when that was not the case. Part of the reason why we're seeing more of that is because there has been a concerted effort to do it, which I think is completely appropriate. Part of what I do when I'm asked to serve on a panel or moderate a panel, either one, as I will make plain that I won't do it unless we have a diverse group of voices. And I don't want to be on a panel of 3 or 4 white men, which can easily happen because it does happen. And so, but I agree, and I think it's great, that Dean, what you're seeing is something that I know is also happening on the staff side of things, right? What I was referring to earlier is more on the consulting side of things, on the staff side of things, where you're seeing amazing people who represent a full range of diversity at the senior level, at the CXO level, at the CEO level. And yes, and I hope that we will continue to elevate those voices in a variety of contexts, and many of them speak for ASAE and speak for other organizations in our community, some of the for-profit entities that are out there, as well as other societies of association executives. So I think that a lot of progress has been made, but I think we can always do more to make sure that those voices are getting every opportunity, because there has been historically a process of exclusion and a process of marginalizing a lot of those voices from within our community, because it's not hard to remember a time when it was extraordinarily dominated by basically one category of people. Wow. And there is still some of that dynamic that exists, but it's definitely improved.
It's true. And I agree with you, Dean, that there are lots of people represented. And as Jeff said, there has been a lot of efforts made. And again, the point I'm trying to make, I'm making badly. So I'm going to move off of that point. Because obviously, like Dean, like you outlined, if you go out and you make the effort to have diverse thought, you're going to be able to do that. And I think that's why, again, bringing it back to kind of the topic of future of thought leadership, that's why I don't like the term thought leader, because people who get that attached to them get elevated in a way that other people don't. Because yes, there are tons of smart people in the nonprofit management profession. I know a lot of them. I meet people all the time with new viewpoints, new ideas. And I think part of the issue with what we call thought leadership is that we are continuing to just pass on old ideas and old information. And there's not enough of us out there saying, wait a minute, we can't keep saying the same thing over and over again. I was having a conversation with Michael Butera a couple weeks ago, and we were talking about like, oh, well, we need to mentor the younger people and, help them move into leadership roles. And I said, I totally agree with that. But how are they bringing in new ideas if everybody is telling them the old ideas? Because that tends to happen in a mentoring situation. It's that knowledge transfer that Dean mentioned. You get people that are telling people, well, this is what we know and how we do it. And then are we actually training the next leaders to think and question, or are we just training them, well, this is the way we've always done it, that old trope that we say all the time?
Jeff's got a good point on this. I'll camp on what he said at your session last week, Jeff, which is it's this concept of best practices. Oh, we should, Dean knows a thing, and so Cecilia should do it, as an example, where there's no evidence that what Dean says you should do actually works, or that it works in the future we anticipate having to be successful in. I'm going to let Jeff expand on it, but I think the Dean, I call it opinion-driven decision making. It worked for Dean at his association 23 years ago, so he just kept telling people to do it. Well, the world within which his association has to be successful is a different world now. So the stuff that worked 23 years ago probably doesn't work as well. Maybe it does, but there's no kind of empirical evidence that it does, other than it worked for Dean at some healthcare association somewhere. And I let Jeff expand on that. I think you're talking about a difference between best practices and effective practices, Jeff, is that what I'm referring to?
I do think that there is a pretty strong connection between the idea of thought leadership and the idea of best practices. And I think Dean has done a good job of, pointing out, and I'm not alone. I think lots of us have this concern about, who defines what a best practice is, and how do we know that that's going to work just because it worked in one place in context there, based on a set of decisions, that were made based on certain players, and, and you can't just take that and transfer it somewhere else. Maybe you can learn something from it, but I wouldn't sort of say, okay, let's just adopt the best practice and move forward, because the concern that I have, and the focus of so much of my work, is on challenging orthodox beliefs, as I mentioned before, the deep-seated assumptions we make about how the world works. In this case, the world we're talking about is the world of associations, or the world of the profession or industry that they're in, or whatever overlapping worlds they have to be concerned about. And the best practices that are frequently shared and adopted wholesale without any critical thinking behind them can often serve to reinforce our orthodox beliefs instead of challenging them. So what I tend to focus on in my work is on, as I said, challenging the orthodoxy, confronting the orthodoxy. When I started out talking about orthodoxy maybe 15 years ago, I thought it was kind of a nuisance, something we should pay attention to, but it wasn't really central to the discussion. And then I've been watching us repeat things, as you're suggesting, in your comments, Cecilia, like if we just keep repeating the same thing and it doesn't change anything, then the orthodoxy is now thick and is now actually holding us captive. So what we need instead is a way to think and act differently. So I tend to focus on what's the orthodoxy, and then how do we establish next practices which will liberate us from the orthodoxy and allow us to think differently, see things differently. And for boards and for staff partners and other contributors to the process, how do you begin to develop a new habit of mind around how you approach your work, right? Because that's got to be a part of it. As an educator, I like something that can do two things, right? So if we can establish a next practice that lets us do it differently and better, and at the same time help our decision makers think about what they're doing differently as well, they come with a new sensibility to their work, thinking and acting beyond orthodoxy, that's good too. So that's really where I am putting a lot of my emphasis, is how do we challenge what we have historically done, maybe sort of reject the best practice and instead design the next practice we need, so that we can lean toward the future and then also, think differently about how we proceed.
To camp on that a little bit, Jeff, just as a quick example, Cecilia, in this orthodoxy. So we've had to modify our research process because of this. And it's not the orthodoxy as, do what you're told. It's that we found boards had a hard time envisioning something different than what they've historically done. And my best example was out of a trade association where we did strategic planning, and we were struggling to do good strategic plans for trade associations because when you asked a board what they might do in an uncertain future, they couldn't get out of how they defined a trade association. Oh, we need a lobbyist. No, we need a trade show. Well, no, you can do other things. So I know we're a trade association. So we have a lobbyist, and we have a trade show. And it was difficult to get active thinkers, people who want to do a good job, to view their association something different than what had been historically. We ran into this also with COVID, which is you'd say, what are the issues impacting your industry? COVID. Well, we know that. What else? It's COVID. So all the problems they had before COVID, they still had, but they had been subsumed by kind of the urgency of COVID. And so on the research side, we had to start asking different questions in a different manner to flush out a more creative perspective on what their association might be capable of doing, because they had a hard time getting their mind to think differently about it based on their historical experience. And I think from a fighting of the orthodoxy, that becomes the kind of one of the central keys is how do you get people to think differently? And you can inform it through research, you can work them through different processes, you can get different people. There's a lot of tactics to it. But I think that's going to be one of the challenges for associations is how do you get people to think differently about how they act as a platform for member success and not simply revert to what they look like in 2020 or 2005, 1905 for some of them.
Yeah. We saw a lot of backsliding, I think, after lockdown ended and people start to go out. All these lessons that we learned the hard way, we decided to forget. And I agree. I saw a lot of associations blaming COVID for problems they had since the 1960s. I was a member of a group and I said, well, how come we don't have a volunteer manual? Oh, because of COVID. And I said, wait a minute, you've been around since 1965. You can't blame COVID for not having a volunteer manual.
20 years of member failure is not COVID's fault.
That's not COVID, right? And so I wanted to get back to, so I'm so glad, Jeff, that you said best practices is not always what everybody should do. I hate that term. And shout out to Jamie Notter and Maddie Grant. Again, my favorite quote from their book, Humanize, which was their first book, is it a best practice or just what everyone else is doing? And so I also like the term next practices, because what are we going to do next? This works now, but it's not going to work next week. And then, Jeff, what you were saying is almost Hegelian. We have to confront the orthodoxy. We have to break the orthodoxy so that we can have the new ideas and the next practices, which then could become the new orthodoxy, which we then have to break again. So it's almost cyclical because we have to keep doing it, right? We can't change once and think it's going to go on. Like Dean, you're a great example of we had to change our research questions because people were stuck in this place. And it's sort of like that law of science of object at rest remains at rest unless it's acted on by an outside force. And so we need to have that outside force, and the way we're thinking, the way we're looking at how we do things, the new role, and it is a new role of associations and other nonprofits within the world. I remember years ago when social media came out and everybody panicked, and Dean, I don't know if you remember this, you and I used to laugh about it all the time. Like, what are they getting so upset about? It's like broadcast facts, but just faster. It's like you could send a broadcast fax to 1,000 people, nobody cared. You do a tweet, oh my God, the world has ended, and it's like adapting to the environment around us, I think. And I don't think anyone thinks more about adapting to the environment around us especially for nonprofits than you do, Dean. So I don't know what your thoughts are about that. How do we get people to be more thoughtful about that?
I think I've approached it kind of from two standpoints. And one is I don't value the future. It's not better or worse. It simply exists. And I always use mergers and acquisitions. We've been studying that for years as one of the factors that influence member decisions because it results in vertical integration, larger companies with more resources, blah, blah, blah. But I always use my own company. If you buy me Association Laboratory and give me $1 trillion, Dean loves M&A activity. If the new owner, Jeff, fires Cecilia, that sucks to be Cecilia. And so Dean has benefited. Cecilia is worse off. Jeff, the future's unknown with his new company, all from the same factor. So when I train my strategists as an example now, it's understanding of the factors. Don't value it, just understand it. What's happening in the marketplace? What are the implications of it on your organization or you personally? And don't value it. You've got plenty of time to value it. But if you value it from the front end, you make worse decisions. Your brain fills in a different list when you say something's a challenge versus an opportunity. And I get back to us asking questions. We ask look at challenge and opportunities to force the brain to get by that neurological bias. And so when you're looking at the future, first and foremost, you have to simply be aware of what is impacting that future within which you have to live and work and practice or whatever it is you're doing. Then you have to understand what are the implications of it on you in terms of whatever context that means. Then you have to decide whether it's good or bad. And if you start off with good and bad, or if you start off with that presupposition as to what it does to you, you limit the creativity of your thinking because of those neurological biases. That sounded really fucking consultanty. Sorry about that, everybody.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, that's all right. Now I got
to can we cuss on the blog? I didn't know if we could cuss. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just gonna say now I have to mark it's got bad language when I cuss.
Content warning.
That's fine, man.
Not safe for work. Yeah, I guess I don't agree with that. It's like, and maybe that's understandable because among my descriptors on LinkedIn, as I'm a Foresight practitioner, and I think part of the reason why our associations struggle is that they devote more attention to valuing the past than to valuing the future. And our organizations are not businesses, right? Our organizations, our societal institutions, they should be managed professionally and intelligently. That absolutely is necessary, but they serve a bigger purpose. They have nonprofit tax status. They are public goods more so than they are, poor man's versions of Google or Microsoft or any other technology or any other kind of company out there. And they have a different role to play in our society. And part of what they have a responsibility for, especially national and international organizations, but even state organizations as well, and going all the way to local organizations, they have some stewardship responsibility for their community, for their profession, for their industry, for the stakeholders that they serve, not just the people who join, but for those who are connected to the work that the organization and its stakeholders perform. And especially in an environment now, as we look toward the rest of this decade and we look toward the 2030s, the increased upheaval that we are seeing, the increased difficulty, increased brittleness of our systems, the increased anxiety that exists out there, the increased sense that nonlinear outcomes will occur, that A to B to C doesn't necessarily seem to be the way things operate anymore. The more incomprehensible we have to deal with things like artificial intelligence and challenges around the climate crisis and other issues, the more of that, there's being more of that, not less of that, right? And so it becomes critical that some institutions in our society, and I think associations are the ones that have to step up on this, because so many of the other institutions of our society, like government, like media, like business, like tech, and others, are simply not trusted, and frankly, in many cases, with good reason. And someone needs to fill that void to say we've got to be able to have hard conversations about difficult issues, even if we're not the solution makers around things. We're not the ones who are going to solve all these problems. We've got to be good contributors, to all of that, and we need our boards and staff partners and others who participate in their work, and other stakeholders as well, to be thinking, deeply about what kind of future are we going to be, leaving to those who will follow us. Dean mentioned he was in my session at Holiday Showcase recently, and I started off by saying to people, the preoccupying question of my professional life, I get up every day and think about it, is what will our successors say about us? And I choose that formulation because it's too easy for me to say, what do I want my legacy to be? Because that's a story that I get to author in which I'm the hero. And I want to challenge the conversation. I want to challenge that for boards as well, to say, you know what? You have a responsibility to people you'll never know. And your responsibility is to do everything you can to leave this thing for which you're responsible, this association, this field, this profession, however you choose to define it, it's all of those and perhaps more. You have a responsibility to leave it better for them, just as surely as you expected that those who preceded you would have done the same thing for you. So I want to challenge boards and our decision makers on the staff and voluntary side to be thinking about the stakes of their responsibility and their need to elevate what they're doing, so that they are thinking in a more forward-looking way, and fulfilling that responsibility to others, especially, as I said, those they will never know personally, because those people are counting on them to make good decisions today, so that they do have a better future if that can be achieved.
And that's an excellent point. I actually agree with both of you to a certain extent.
Yeah, I'm not sure where we were disagreeing.
Yeah, I know. But I love that quote, Dean, that you just said. I don't value the future because it's not necessarily more valuable or better. But I also agree with Jeff that we also have to, and Dean, I think you agree with him too, like you just said. We want to do our best. We want to build that better future. But in order for us to do better, and this kind of bringing us back to our topic, the future of thought leadership, we have to actually learn to think, and we actually have to think. And thinking takes work, and it's hard, and you can get better at it, but you have to actually think. And the problem is, like you've both made this point, we tend to default to things. This is the way we did it before COVID. This is the way we did it when we had a brick and mortar office. This is the way we did it, last week. And we tend to do that. And what a lot of us don't understand is the history of how we got where we are as associations and other types of nonprofits. So our whole model started actually in the 19th century. And the oldest organization that we might call a nonprofit by our definition today started in 1745 to help freed slaves. It was a group that came together, had a mission, organized. And so that was one of the very first ones here in North America. Now, when we look at this, though, the way we do things, having boards, having mini-me chapters, these meetings that we have, these huge conferences and things like that, that's all from the 19th and early 20th century. We are well into the 21st century now. And the world really is very different, how we live, how we use tools, how we connect, how we do things. So we can start and stop a movie now. When I was a little kid, if you weren't there at 7 o'clock on Friday night, you were not going to see the Brady Bunch. I mean, you had to wait till next week. We have access to everything whenever we want it right now. Yet we're still thinking, acting, making decisions, behaving as if everything is the way it used to be. We still go to the office 9 to 5. I have to commute. I have to do this. And all of that broke as soon as we could do remote work. It just broke. And the whole thing, you both mentioned COVID, and COVID being like the default, oh, it's because of COVID. It's like COVID didn't force us into doing webinars. We were already doing webinars. It didn't force us into webcam conferences. We were already doing that. We were just going at a slower pace. And then we got forced into it. And so we defaulted after the lockdown ended. Oh, we can go back to the way things used to be, because people are always looking for normalcy. But my favorite quote from the movie Tombstone is when Doc Holliday says to Wyatt Earp, there is no normal life, Wyatt, there's just life. And I think if we can approach it that way, there is no normal life. There's just, we have life, we have our life, other people have their lives, we all have our lives. Our organizations all have a life. So how are we going to make those best decisions for that organization going forward?
I don't know. I'll throw in an example from one of our clients. They celebrated their 100th anniversary 2 years ago. And the board was complaining about how hard they had it. Now, they're a global group. They're still adapting to COVID. And I actually challenged them a little bit. They were kind of whining, frankly. They were founded right after World War I. So picture that first board. And they founded because of the atrocities of World War I, particularly regarding women. Tens of millions of people are dead. Europe is destroyed as we know it. Countries and kingdoms, as we normally read about in history books, are now gone. Women in America can't vote at that point. They're also enjoying the Spanish flu pandemic simultaneously. And that's the environment within which this board meets for the first or second time. So I introduced that to them, and now you're 100 years later, and think of the progress that you've contributed to over the last 100 years. So your question then is, how do you simply take your turn contributing to that progress moving forward, whatever that means for you within the world within which you operate? And I think that's where I've been very adamant about this, which is you're creating your organization and yourself to be successful at some future state, not today. As a result, you have to come to some conclusions in your mind of what that future state might look like. There will be more or less boundaries. There will be more or less money. There will be more or less disruptions, however you define it. And I think where I'm seeing people, it's called the retrospectoscope, and it's 100% accurate. Looking behind you is always accurate. Looking in front of you is always a risk. Too often in associations, we punish risk takers. I had a CEO tell me once, the board wants you to do what they would have told you to do if they had known it was going to work. And so when you punish risk taking, you take on a more bureaucratic mindset. Okay. And when you listen to our colleagues talk about their budget size and how many staff they boss around, that's a bureaucratic measure, not one of success. And I think we have to start changing our mindset in the association sector to have an investment mindset. I know we're doing an annual meeting in 11 months, but are we going to do that same meeting 3 years from now, 5 or 10 years from now? What does it look like in the future? And I think if we start changing ourselves to an investment mindset, a longer term perspective beyond my year as president or beyond my role as a CEO, we'll start to have organizations that are more adaptable to what the future always has, which is uncertainty and disruptions in some frame or other.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great point. I like that. Jeff, do you have a comment?
Well, I think, you mentioned earlier that in February, you and I are going to talk about the duty of foresight. Next year is the 10-year milestone of the duty of foresight. I first wrote about it in 2014. And, I think that in and of itself is something I would consider to be a next practice, right? To sort of shift our thinking about what boards do and how they focus their attention. And I think as we look, I agree that there have been times throughout our history when we've had difficult periods. But I think the problem that I have with saying, well, because it was bad 100 years ago, or was bad 50 years ago, or 60 years ago, that we shouldn't assume that it will be bad now, because there are a lot of challenges now, and those challenges are intensifying and worsening as we go. So, and by the way, none of us were alive back in 1918 or in 1941 or in, at any other difficult, in many of those places. So we've got to adapt ourselves to a set of challenges that are going to be unique to us as we go toward, the next decade into the rest of this century. And so the duty of foresight is about challenging our boards to train their perspective, to direct their perspective on where we are going. It's a choice, right? It's unlike the duties of care, loyalty, and obedience, which are mandated. But this is a choice to say we're going to stand up for our successors' futures in our work. We're going to, undertake the difficult challenge of intentional learning to try to understand what these issues mean for us and for where we go in the future. That we're going to take action in the short term to try to de-risk the future for those who follow us. That we're going to try to make sure we have that long-term perspective that Dean's referring to, which I completely agree with. And so, I think that what we need in 2024 and what we need in the following years is a real effort on the part of our decision makers to lean into how they're going to guide their organizations into this future, which will not be getting any easier. And I think we have, some unique and difficult challenges ahead of us that we've got to be grappling with, and we should have been grappling with a decade ago. But nevertheless, here we are. And I would completely agree. I thought that I really believe that COVID would shake us out of our complacency in a more enduring way. I was wrong, right? And I'm sad to be wrong, because I think we've made that hard turn back to where we were before. We've reaccepted, and re-embraced our orthodoxy, and in many cases, and we have allowed that to shape where we see ourselves and where we're headed, and putting ourselves on a trajectory that I'm concerned about. Right? I don't think it's unrecoverable, but I think we've got to be able to adjust. Now I think now is the time. The window for that is this moment, and I'm hopeful that we can continue do that and continue to move in a new direction. So we'll talk more about the duty of foresight in specific in our next visit. But I do think that's
yeah.
it's a very important shift in the way our boards function as we look toward the rest of this decade and beyond.
To camp on Jeff a little bit, we've talked about next practices, and part of the way next practices become recognized is you realize the environment's forcing you to do them all the time. We like to think of ourselves as being intentional about it. You're gonna do all these sorts of things, and one of the things that stood out for me with our client work is it didn't seem to matter the strategic question. Did they come to us for education strategy or membership strategy or strategic planning? The first thing you had to do was get them talking about the future in some fashion, and you could do it in very sophisticated ways. You could do it in very casual ways, but simply by focusing them on the future, whatever you called it and however you did it, you had better conversations about what they could or should not do as a result of that future, and it didn't matter the question. And I think that's how you start to recognize within our sector there are some things that the environment is forcing on us. We don't do a lot of looking backwards stuff as a company because no one cares what happened 2 years ago. A lot of things based on historical transactional data, you have to revalidate. You can't count on it the way you might have. And so the environment is forcing a lot of people to start thinking about the future more intentionally and aggressively than they would have a couple of years ago because they realized they weren't prepared for COVID and they should have been. Again, a lot of, to your point, Cecilia, we were using Zoom pre-COVID. We were using all this stuff pre-COVID. There were virtual. I mean, I went virtual in 2003, so it's not like virtual business models are some rarity. But the environment, I think, often has forced us. And I think the challenge a lot of the CEOs are meeting now is it's comfortable for the board to look backward because they recognize that they're familiar with it. They know they know its weakness as well as its strength, and they're having a hard time thinking about that. So as an example, at our healthcare conference, we've got a whole session devoted to strategic governance change. How do you get your volunteer leaders to look where you point, which is the future? And how do you move some of these organizations with archaic governance structures? They're set up in 1908 to be successful in an environment where maybe some of the issues are the same, pandemic and war and economic disruption, but they hit much faster. They are much more dynamic and have an intensity level, I think, that is difficult to adjust to. And it's going to be interesting how many CEOs in particular are successful at getting their boards to do that in whatever mechanism, whatever tactic they use.
Yeah, wow, just so many thoughts in my own head about that, because we do tend to go back to the familiar. And I actually had Michael Weiland and Michael Butera on the podcast a few weeks back, and we were talking about, do we still need executive committees? Because the reason we used to have an executive committee was because the whole board couldn't meet all the time. But now we still have that, even though you can all jump on the phone together or you can all jump on a Zoom call together. The whole board can be involved now. There was a time that wasn't possible. We have these big annual conventions because back in the 19th century, these things would last for 3 months because it took too long to get places. We can travel instantly. We can talk on the phone. We can send a fax. I still remember I was sending a fax to Australia one time in my first job in Washington, D.C. at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And I was like, wow, this is coming out on the other side of the world, and things like that. And I think trying to get people to open their minds up to possibilities of what we have available and that the future isn't scary. It's just an unknown. It's like Donald Rumsfeld used to say, the known unknowns. We know what we don't know. Let's go find it. Let's figure it out. So that is why the future can be scary, because we don't know exactly what's there. It's like going into a dark room until you turn the light on. And then all of a sudden, oh, well, the room's not scary anymore because I can see it. I really think trying to get our boards to change and to think differently, this is just an ongoing, almost Sisyphus pushing the rock up the mountain. We push it up and we think we're getting somewhere, and then it comes back and we got to do it again. So I think we have to consistently keep educating everyone, the board, the staff, everybody, that we can think differently. We can do things differently. I remember I use this example a lot. I used to work at a specialty bar association with all the components and special interest groups and things. And we changed their networking event at one of the conferences. And one of them came up to me very worried and said, "What if this doesn't work?" And I said, "Then we won't do it again." Like the light in his eyes was so bright. I couldn't believe it. It's like, yeah, try it. If it doesn't work, don't do it again, or wait until the time it will work. Because sometimes it's not the right time for things. Jeff, you look like you want to say something.
Well, I'll just say that the future is more knowable than we realize, right? Because there's a lot of data around things, and so some of that data, it's not a completely blank page. We have demographic information, and we have historical information that can be used to project things. So I think we want to what we really want to do, and again, this is more in the foresight realm, is say, what are the plausible futures? Like the conversation that I'm having, that I would have with a board, is what are the potential favorable futures? What are the potential unfavorable futures? What are the potential unthinkable futures, right? We need to look at all of them. We can't just focus on the ones that we hope will happen, the ones that will make us happy. Boards, as a decision-making group, is a group that has to anticipate, where things are going, that have to be prepared for the challenges of upheaval, that has to be able to navigate the challenges of the environment, will want to build its resilience and its decision making by being prepared to consider, okay, there are futures that could be good for our association and our profession or industry. There are futures that could be very bad for it, and there are futures that could be unthinkably bad for it. And I think that one of the tendencies is to only focus on the future that we want, the future that we think would be good, and without regard to how other forces beyond our control, how other things that we know are quite plausibly could happen. That's one of the things that makes COVID such an important thing for us to learn from, because we knew before COVID happened that a global pandemic was a distinct possibility. We had been warned. We've had other pandemics and epidemics in the past. We were not ready for it, right? And it was a wild card development that we were simply not ready to adapt to when it occurred, even though it had been discussed. So now, in the work that I'm doing, with boards on foresight, and with associations on foresight, say we've got to be thinking about wild cards in every respect, not just societal wild cards like a global pandemic, but also wild cards that could affect your profession or industry, wild cards that could affect the specific part of the industry that you occupy, and to really look at that bigger picture of where things could go. So I think that robust ability for anticipation, to focus more board attention on these conversations and allow other decision makers to carry some of the burden for the more routine traditional activities that boards have performed, so that boards can really put their attention on where things are going, because they can't outsource this responsibility. This is a unique a unique aspect of their role, is that they're the only group that has the combination of responsibility, authority, and opportunity to undertake this work. They need a lot of help and a lot of support and a lot of contribution from a wide variety of people, but ultimately they're the ones who are charged with navigating the environment for their organizations. They are the group that is navigating the organization into the future. And so I think that we've got to, what I'm trying to do is really challenge them to push themselves into a different space, and a different, leaning into their responsibilities, their stewardship responsibilities in this regard, and to have it change the way they think about the governing aspects of their work, and to really, use the duty of foresight becomes the centerpiece for the way they think about what they're trying to accomplish.
And if we can't get our boards to do that, what use are they? At the end of the day, you can only ask your volunteer leaders to contribute where they can contribute. We don't need their advice on member models. We don't need their advice on where to put the conference. We don't need their advice on complying with FASAE regulations. We need them to tell us what their industry or profession is going to look like, what's impacting it, and what they want to do as a result. And I think, and I've used this many times, our leaders will look where we point. And if we point at postage, that's where they're going to look. And if we point at the future and if we create processes to help them discuss it productively, then they can help us as staff people. But it's up to us, I think, as executives to put them in a position to contribute in ways that their unique knowledge actually helps us, as opposed to just waste everybody's time.
That's right. And well said, Dean. Thank you. Because I think our board model totally needs an update in how they're educated, what they do, and as you said, where are we pointing them? Where are they looking? And it's very difficult to get people to change direction. It's difficult to get them to look somewhere they don't want to look. And I think a lot of times they're afraid to look in the other direction. And that's board recruitment. That's a whole other podcast. How do we find the best members for our board of directors so that we get that value, that contribution that we really need. So I really hate to wrap up this conversation because I have a feeling we probably could talk for another hour, but I know we all have other things to do and other places to be. So before we wrap up, I'll ask each of you for the thought you would like the audience to take away today and how people can get in touch with you if they want to follow up, because I'm sure you will have follow-up questions. So let's start with Dean. What's your final thought and how can people get in touch?
I think my final thought is something I've said several times. Your board, regardless of who sits on it, is going to look where you point. And if you point in the wrong direction as a staff CEO, they're going to look at the wrong thing. And we can't expect our boards to perform their role for us if we don't put them in a position where they can succeed. And that's on us as staff people. If you want more resources on that, go to associationlaboratory.com. You can access the Looking Forward dashboard for free. After registration, there are 9, soon to be 10 different sector studies. You can customize it, you can download it. You can use that information to guide staff and board discussions. Or I encourage you to look at our Knowledge Center, where we have everything from webinars to white papers that you can use to inform those as well. Some free, some not free. And anything else we can do to help you, never hesitate to reach out to dwest@associationlaboratory.com. I'm happy to help however we can help.
Great. Well, thank you, Dean. All right, Jeff, what's your final thought, closing thought for the audience, and how can they get in touch?
So I would encourage everyone. Thank you, Cecilia and Dean, for a really compelling conversation. I think that I would go back to the question that I mentioned earlier. That is the preoccupying question in my professional life: what will our successors say about us? Everyone who's watching this, listening to this, has predecessors, and so therefore you are a successor, and you will have successors as well. So the question you want to ask yourself is, what are you doing to make sure you're leaving it better for those who will follow you, right? In whatever role you play, whether you're a board member, CEO, CXO, staff person, whatever contribution you're making to the association community now, whatever contribution you'll make as your career continues, what will your successors say about you? I think it's an important reflection for us to pursue on a daily basis, to be informing and challenging us to be doing everything we can to leave it better than how we found it, and to think about that in the way that we conduct our work. For me, I don't expect it to become everyone else's preoccupying question, but for me, it informs the way that I write things. It informs the way that I present things, the way I participate in every activity. So I would hope that everyone would give that question some consideration, because I think the more that we think about others in all of this and not just ourselves, the better off our conversations are going to be. I am reachable on I think the best place to look for things that I've written. Actually, I'll mention 2 places. One is jeffonlinkedin.com. I have my own, I created, bought my own custom URL to make it easier to find me on LinkedIn. So jeffonlinkedin.com is a great place. And also you can go to authory.com/Foresight First, and which is a place that a lot of the work that I've written can be found. You can find it also on LinkedIn, and people are welcome to reach out at jeff@foresightfirst.io.
Great. Well, thank you both. I always enjoy talking with both of you, and it's great getting to talk to you both at the same time. So thanks again for accepting my invitation. We have to go rogue for now, but we'll be back next time with another exciting episode. So don't forget to subscribe or follow us on your favorite podcast service. We're on pretty much all of them right now. If you'd like to learn more about Rogue Tulips Consulting and how we could help you bloom outside the box, check out our website, roguetulips.com. If, like all three of us, you're a curious sort and you'd like to get some education about nonprofit management, check out our education program. It's so big, it has its own website, the 501cleague.net. We're working on the 2024 course schedule as we speak. We are currently offering an on-demand course if you want to check that out, and we have one more ethics course this month if you need to get that ethics credit to renew this year. So thanks again for joining us, everyone. And on behalf of Jeff Dean and myself, we'll see you next time.